Welcome to Stifel's Sightlines podcast, focusing each week on a topic or two important to investors.
Well, greetings and welcome to the Sightlines podcast. This is Michael O'Keefe, Stifel's Chief Investment Officer. In this episode, I want to get into essentially some details on the task forces that Kevin Warsh has put in place to reflect on the way the Fed operates on a number of dimensions. And, maybe to take a step back and just reiterate a couple of interesting learnings is Warsh really has adopted a bit of a plainer style, less communication, more focused. So a more brief statement that came out of his first meeting, no forward guidance in that statement. And for himself, no participation in the summary of economic projections. So he's not into, forecasting in the dot plot and all that, his outlook, although the rest of the participants did what they normally do. And so anyway, I want to jump into this idea of the task forces. So 5 different groups. And essentially what he's done is to define what the work is. He's identified external experts to be the leaders of this. And then, of course, they'll draw on the staff of the Fed to get some work done. But also it's pretty contained from a calendar perspective in that the expectation is for the work to be done basically in 2026 with the release of reports and whatever by the end of the year, which is kind of refreshing to see something kind of tightly communicated. Now, as it relates to the task force areas of focus, they include productivity and jobs, data, the balance sheet, communications, and inflation. So let's jump into it. The productivity and jobs, it'll study how new technology, for example, is changing the economy and creating potential. So it'll include things like the impact of AI and automation on the economy's capacity to grow, answer questions that feed directly into the Fed's view of the future, right? Potential growth and what might be, therefore, an influence on the neutral interest rate. The data task force looks to modernize how the Fed sees the economy. And I think there's a general concept here, which is that Warsh is not a big fan of what's really lagged data. So you think about it, we've got organizations, some in the government, some out of the government, that are collecting data, doing surveys, trying to collect a bunch of stuff and get it into sort of various data series, indices, and so forth. And that collection process and the production process takes weeks and weeks. So what you end up doing is waiting for data to kind of take a pulse on something that might have happened weeks ago. And so there's this concept of real-time data where, usually it's a little bit more market-driven, but where you can see the information and the influence of the information much more quickly. And so that's going to be a key focus when it comes to the data task force. I'm sure they'll also look at the kinds of data that they're looking at. But interestingly, and we'll get into the details a little later, one of the leaders of this task force is a former Walmart CEO who's accustomed to seeing real-time data on demand and prices and supply chains. So I think the idea is go out to industry and pull people in this case, that have experience with this idea of focusing on real time. So that's interesting. Balance sheet policy sort of looks to revisit the size, role, and management of the Fed's balance sheet, which sits just under $7 trillion. And, the idea here, of course, is that the balance sheet's there to provide liquidity. It's sort of intended to be there in times of trouble. It's grown a little bit around the financial crisis, then more notably around the pandemic. And so the group will weigh the costs and benefits of the current regime, which tends to be, use the balance sheet a lot and it's okay for it to be big. I think there's just this general sense that the chair, Kevin Warsh, is not a big fan of a bigger balance sheet. And maybe the idea is to have it be small and then use that liquidity injection when there are real signs of trouble. But again, we'll see what the study shows. And in any event, one sort of second order effect here is that whether or not the balance sheet is big and how that is invested will have an effect on treasuries and longer term yields. And so again, maybe at a later date, we'll get into the details of that. Now, communications is another area of focus, another task force. And I think, again, the idea here is that there have been regimes in the past where the communication has been extensive. So think of it as statements that are, pages and pages long. And then under Warsh's leadership, it's super tight, super short. And so they're going to unpack that kind of communication, probably a little bit around speeches and things like that, and what are officials signaling through speeches. But then the summary of economic projections, which is sort of this data focus, it's the projections by officials that get summarized in this report. We expect that to survive, as well as things like the post-meeting press conference. But they may evolve a little bit. And yet, against this backdrop, I think Warsh is saying he favors transparency, but I think the gist of it is he's not a big fan of the Fed sort of signaling future views or sort of future policy. And again, we'll see more as that task force work unfolds. Now, inflation frameworks is also in focus, that concept. And the idea here is for the Fed to take a look at how it models really anticipation of future inflation. What it really cares about is expectations and where we're headed, less than, let's say, where we've been. And so there will be a body of work to try to understand how they're doing that, and then ways to sort of better capture the effects of things like supply shocks, tariffs, and, for example, the growing demand on electricity to drive AI. So think supply as well as demand-focused frameworks, and the current regime basically approach is a little bit more demand-focused. Now, next up is just the idea of, well, how did he put these task forces together? And, was there, for example, this sense of, let's pull in some friends that align either policy or politically, and kind of get people in there that can rubber stamp what he wants to do. And I think the takeaway from the assignments, and it's typically, I think, three individuals that are sort of assigned from outside to be kind of overseeing the effort from an external advisory perspective. What we've seen is that it's sort of from a variety of places, certainly sprinkled in are some central bank experience, and former Fed officials, but just a few of those. But also, you can think academics, very senior business people, et cetera. And so anyway, to jump into it, let me just kind of run through. So Mark Andreessen, co-founder of Andreessen Horowitz, Asha Sharma, CEO, Xbox, and Charles I. Jones from Stanford University. That's the group doing productivity and jobs. Kind of interesting to have somebody from Andreessen Horowitz in that realm, because they're, as they invest, they're going to be studying that. For data, it's Raj Shetty from Harvard, Doug McMillan, former CEO of Walmart, who I mentioned, Kevin Murphy from the University of Chicago. So again, I'm going to guess people who are used to studying and evaluating how to consider data and how best to use it. Next up, balance sheet policy. Jeremy Stein at Harvard, but a former Fed governor. Rajaram Rajan, University of Chicago, former governor of the Reserve Bank of India. That's interesting. Karen Dinan, Harvard, former U.S. Treasury chief economist. So, some serious people here. Again, probably all with good experience with the concept of the balance sheet and what might go on from there. All right, communications. Mervyn King, former governor, Bank of England. Aminio Fraga, founder, Gavia, former governor, Central Bank of Brazil, Peter Fisher, University of Washington, former U.S. Treasury Undersecretary. And then finally, inflation frameworks, N. Gregory Mankiw, Harvard, former CEA chair, Thomas J. Sargent, NYU, New York University, and then William White, the Howe Institute, CD Howe Institute, former BIS economic advisor. So again, not going in deep into the details here, except to say, I think the takeaway, we've done a lot of work sort of studying their backgrounds, their biases and all that. The general takeaway is that this group of external advisors is pretty balanced. Certainly highly credentialed and experienced, but also pretty balanced. And we view that positively. I think the idea is to take a constructive, reflective view on how things are done, look for ways to make them better, get it done in a short, concise amount of time, maybe identify areas of focus for further debate and discussion and research, all good. And, I would just say, that overall we're pretty optimistic about how things are unfolding when it comes to these task forces. So anyway, thank you so much for listening to this episode, and we look forward to catching you on the next one.
Thanks again for listening to Stifel's Sightlines. Be sure to subscribe wherever you're listening to automatically receive each week's podcast in your feed.